Hi there. Welcome to another online video lesson intended to provide you important principles and helpful tips for the study and practice of argumentation. This is the second in a two-part series looking at the logical importance of evidence. In the first part of this series, we looked at the characteristics of what makes evidence what it is, with a particular eye toward what makes evidence effective in order to convince an audience of the truth of your claim. So at the start of this video, we'll briefly review those characteristics. But what I want to focus on in this video is a really important aspect of understanding evidence from the logical perspective of argument. We don't just want to seem convincing in order to persuade the audience, we actually want to be correct, accurate, true. So what's going to be important to us, not only if we're constructing our own arguments, but especially when we're analyzing and evaluating the arguments of others, is we need to have some rules of thumb for evaluating the evidence that's being used in order to support claims. And so we'll take a look at 7 specific tests of evidence, as explained by Inch and Tudor in their 2014 text, Critical Thinking and Communication. But first, a brief moment of review. Last time, we defined evidence, as Inch and Tudor do, as facts or conditions that are objectively observable, beliefs or statements generally accepted as true by the recipients, or conclusions that are previously established in argument. One of the things that we emphasized in our last video is that while facts are very important, it is very possible and sometimes the best choice to use evidence that is not expressly factual but expresses opinion as to fact, especially when we're trying to draw conclusions or interpret what specific facts mean. But whether or not we're talking about facts or opinions as to fact, the other big point that we emphasized in our previous video was that in order for an argument to be successful, ultimately evidence needs to be something that the audience can accept as true. If the audience doesn't accept that your evidence is true, then they can't accept the correctness of your claim. Now again, we don't just want to be concerned with whether or not our arguments are effective on our audience. What we want to consider is, are our arguments logically sound? And so we need to consider the quality of the evidence if we're going to assess whether or not the claim has been amply supported. And so Inch and Tudor talk about 7 specific tests that we want to look at with some examples in this lesson: reliability, expertise, objectivity, consistency, recency, relevance, and access. The first test is reliability, and Inch and Tudor define reliability as evidence sources that have proven to be correct many times in the past. The rule of thumb here is that if the evidence is coming from a source that has been right a lot and has a pretty good public track record for being accurate, then if they're giving us something that's being reported as fact or as reliable opinion, we can count on the veracity of that source. And so when we're talking about reliability, often we're going to think about things such as peer-reviewed research journals. In academic and professional research, peer review means that the journal is not going to publish the research study or related article unless a small group of experts in that field vet that article, go over it with a fine-tooth comb based on their expertise, and determine whether or not the study's been done the right way and we can safely and reliably count on what's being reported in that article as accurate. So peer-reviewed research journals are a good source of reliable information. In addition, especially when we're talking about things like current events and late-breaking information, respected mainstream journalistic sources are going to be something that you can generally count on as reliable evidence sources. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, because I've been reading the public opinion polls over the past couple of decades that have shown that public trust in the mainstream news media as being a reliable source of information has declined pretty precipitously. However, a lot of this has to do with controversy and discourse in the public sphere regarding some of the kinds of things that get discussed in mainstream journalism, particularly issues of political controversy, especially in the United States when we're talking about competing partisan or competing ideological standpoints. One of the things that often gets accused of news coverage that runs contrary to what a specific group with a particular point of view believes is that, well, that information is just not accurate, and it's another example of how you just can't rely on the news media. However, it's important to note the vast majority of news coverage in the vast majority of mainstream journalistic sources is accurate. A lot of attention is paid in the media to moments when the news media get it wrong. And the news media are occasionally going to get it wrong because the news media are made up of human beings who are, of course, fallible. But it's important to note that when we're talking about mainstream news sources, we're talking about organizations that subscribe to the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. The SPJ Code was developed by the journalism industry in the mid-20th century specifically due to concerns that in order not just to uphold their ethical responsibility as the Fourth Estate, to provide the public with information that they need to know, because, again, remember, the news media is the only industry in the entire United States that has specific constitutional protection, the First Amendment freedom of the press, after all. So the press have a responsibility to get it right. But also, based on their business model, if they want to continue to have readers for their newspapers or viewers for their television news programming or shares and retweets, etc., for digital news platforms, they have to get it right. Because if they get it wrong, they lose audience share, and that's something that's important to them. So the first point of the SPJ Code of Ethics is to seek truth and report it, and the fourth point of the Code of Ethics is to be accountable and transparent. Remember that all cries of liberal bias, for instance, to the side, it is against the best interest of mainstream journalism to get it wrong. And specifically with regard to allegations of mainstream media liberal bias, which we often hear in political discourse, there have been peer-reviewed study after peer-reviewed study by nonpartisan researchers that have essentially debunked this myth. The vast majority of news sources do not have a demonstrable liberal bias. Because it's important to remember, after all, that the mainstream news media include news outlets like Fox News, newspapers like the Washington Times, and the editorial staff of the Wall Street Journal that have expressly conservative points of view. So it's important to remember that mainstream news, in and of itself, is pretty reliable. We still want to read it critically, but we don't want to dismiss it out of hand because it's the news. However, as I said, we do need to be critical. And critical consumption of news means that we need to make some distinctions. For instance, the distinction between straight hard news reporting and analysis and commentary, especially by political pundits. Let me tell you about a study that was recently released by PUNDITFACT, which is affiliated with the Pulitzer Prize-winning PolitiFact fact-checking journalistic organization. PUNDITFACT looked at the truthfulness of statements being made by on-air news personalities and the pundits that they had on as guests to provide their opinions about various political and social issues. They looked specifically at the commentary and punditry on sources such as CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. Now, again, we're not talking about straight hard news coverage. We're talking about commentary shows. We're talking about analysis and debate shows and bringing on expert guests and pundits to provide their analysis on the issues of the day. And what they were especially interested in looking at were statements made by these personalities and pundits that were mostly false, or pants on fire false. And here's what they found. On-air news personalities and their pundit guests on CNN said things that were false 27% of the time. On MSNBC, those personalities and pundits said things that were false 42% of the time. And on Fox News, personalities and pundits got it wrong 59% of the time. Now, you can make what you will of this particular pattern, but one of the important things that we need to make sure we pull out of these observations is that there is a difference between straight news reporting and news analysis, commentary, and punditry. The former is going to be a much more reliable source of information than the latter. But it's often the latter where a lot of people get their news information. And we've got to take that stuff with a grain of salt. And if there's anything we need to take with even more grains of salt, perhaps the entire salt shaker, it's the kind of news information that gets disseminated on the internet, especially social media, that comes from news sources that you may have never heard of before. And this gets us into the idea of fake news. In the 2016 presidential election, the phenomenon of fake news became really salient in the U.S. political imaginary, given what was going on and what we subsequently learned was a concerted effort by the Russian intelligence agencies to provide disinformation to the American voting public during the election season in order to pull electoral support away from Hillary Clinton and towards Donald Trump. Incidentally, this isn't a made-up idea. This is something that's been verified not only by tons of mainstream journalistic research, but also by the recent report released by independent prosecutor Robert Mueller, working for the Department of Justice. So there was a really interesting study that was published by BuzzFeed that looked at total Facebook engagements for the top 20 election stories at various points during the 2016 election. Facebook was singled out because as people learned more about the fake news phenomenon, Facebook was one of the primary, if not the most important place where the dissemination of fake news, defined as deliberately incorrect information that's disseminated on purpose. What the study did was looked at engagements, the total number of shares, reactions, and comments for a piece of content. And they looked at top 20 election story content from mainstream news outlets, places like CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, major broadcast networks. And they compared that with organizations that were later identified to be expressly fake news organizations. And what did they find? Well, at the early part of the general election season, mainstream news was, as usual, much more engaged with by the Facebook public. But notice the trend lines, with mainstream news being engaged with decreasingly, whereas fake news really spikes in the late spring and early summer of 2016, when the fake news organizations working for the Russian government really got their act in gear, around the time that was right before the Democratic and Republican national conventions. So by the time we get to Election Day, fake news engagements outpaced mainstream news engagements by over 1.5 million. Now, that's pretty scary. And what do we pull away from this? Well, again, if we're looking for reliable sources of information as opposed to sources that might be fake news, we want to look to mainstream sources that are widely known and have a long-standing public reputation for presenting sound journalism, as opposed to these niche digital sources. Many times we can't even identify who subsidizes them and where the reporting comes from. It's important to note, finally, as we put a pin in fake news and move on to our next test, that fake news is not, as some political figures like to define it, news from mainstream sources that say things that the folks accusing fake news don't happen to like. Fake news is fake news because it's fake. It's deliberately concocted to be incorrect in order to mislead the public. And that is not something that the mainstream news media do because, frankly, it's bad for their business model. Okay, so that's the test of reliability. The next test we need to think about is expertise, defined by Inch and Tudor as possession of a background of knowledge and information relevant to the subject matter under discussion. Expertise is going to be important not only if we want a reliable source for facts, but also if we're looking for good opinion as to fact. When we need, for instance, interpretation of what facts mean, or drawing conclusions or predictions about what something might mean in the future, sometimes we need to get well-informed opinion. And expertise, folks that have specific knowledge, specific professional experience in an area, can be a really important source of research. So if you're looking to find expert evidence yourself, looking to scholars who do research in those fields, as well as professional specialists that have worked in that particular area and have made it their livelihood, are going to be pretty good sources of expertise. One thing, of course, to watch out for are folks that purport to be experts, but really aren't experts. And this kind of thing happens in the popular media all the time. Let me take you back to the 1990s, a time where there was a lot of popular media attention to expert figures providing advice in very entertaining and accessible means about romantic relationships, family relationships, friendships, and so forth. Two of the most popular, and ultimately for both of them at certain points, infamous figures in this area are Dr. Laura Schlesinger and Dr. John Gray. Laura Schlesinger, known by many as Dr. Laura, is a very famous radio talk personality who provided on-air advice on relationships, family issues, friendships, a widespread national syndicated radio following. For a short time, she had a television show. Her reputation achieved some notoriety when she started making homophobic commentary regarding the illegitimacy of LGBTQ identity and relationships, as well as information coming out about her use of racist language at one or two moments. But that's not the reason I'm concerned about her, although I'm certainly concerned about her for those reasons. One of the things that Dr. Laura purported to do was provide information and advice on personal relationships, which are among the most impactful things going on in all of our lives. And if you're getting that kind of information on that kind of sensitive and important matter, you would hope that the person giving you advice has some expertise. Now, she's Dr. Laura, right? She's got a PhD in physiology, specifically nutrition physiology. Her dissertation research was involving insulin injections in rats. She has academic research expertise, but not in the areas in which she was providing advice. Then there's John Gray. In the 1990s, John Gray published Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, a practical guide for improving communication and getting what you want in your relationship. This book was a blockbuster bestseller, sold millions upon millions of copies, and ended up generating for Gray a franchise, a bunch of additional books, as well as talk show appearances. He had his own television talk show for a while, and then he eventually parlayed this into podcasts and writing newspaper columns and things like that. Now again, John Gray is a PhD. Where is his expertise? Well, he got his college degree from a little-known university in Iowa that revolves around the philosophy of transcendental meditation, which is a very niche, holistic philosophy. And the place really doesn't have a great reputation. He does have a PhD from an organization, again, focusing on this holistic transcendental meditation philosophy. It's an unaccredited university, and he got that PhD through a correspondence course. So his PhD is prominently featured on the cover of his book to let you know that, hey, he's got expertise. He knows what he's talking about. But his academic credentials are really, really sketchy. And they don't focus specifically in many of the areas that he's been writing about and providing advice on for decades. If you're looking for information about romantic relationships and sound sources of advice, you want to go to mainstream professional scholars that have academic expertise, that have studied in this area, that have professional credentials in this area, and have researched and published hundreds upon hundreds of articles in peer-reviewed research journals. Folks like Leslie Baxter, Daniel Canary, Laura Stafford. There are experts that you can go to. Their information is widely accessible. All you need to do is go to a library database and find it, and you can get the good, real expertise to back up any arguments that you want to make about romantic relationships. These folks don't have talk shows and radio programs and best-selling books in paperback because they're too busy doing serious research. And that's where you want to get your expertise from. Now, that being said, it's important to note that even when we're talking about academic and professional experts, we still want to think critically. Let's stay in the 1990s for just a bit while I talk to you about this guy, Dr. Andrew Wakefield. Wakefield is a medical researcher who achieved global acclaim when he published a blockbuster study in 1997 in The Lancet, which is one of the most prestigious medical research journals in the world. The study that he published established links between children who were vaccinated and children who subsequently developed autism. And so this study was the linchpin for what would become a massive global anti-vaccination movement, as understandably, parents across the globe concerned about the possibility that their children might be developing autism due to local, state, and national regulations requiring vaccinations in order to go to a public school, for instance. Well, this was something that was really troubling to lots of people, especially some prominent media personalities. In 2007, Jenny McCarthy, actress, media personality, and the mother of an autistic son, got involved in the anti-vaccination community through doing Google research and looking into possible reasons for her son's autism and possible ways to treat it. And she ran across the Wakefield research and stuff that came from it. And famously in 2007 appeared on Oprah Winfrey's television show to talk all about her experience with her son and talking about the research information that was out there regarding the possible risks of vaccinations that the medical community in the United States and around the world were trying to suppress. And Winfrey gave these arguments an international platform. Here's the problem. From the time that the Wakefield study was originally published 10 years before this Oprah Winfrey appearance, many medical experts scrutinized the study and started finding some real serious methodological problems with how the study was done. It didn't really look on the up and up, and this was something that caught the attention of investigative journalists in Britain who did some digging and found out that there were some really problematic ethical problems with the way that Wakefield conducted his study, the way that he cherry-picked the results, the way that he designed the study in a way that made it impossible to find conflicting information, so on and so forth. Suffice it to say that by the year 2010, 10 of Wakefield's co-authors actually assisted the process of the Lancet retracting Wakefield's study. A retraction essentially means that the journal disavowed itself from that study, saying that this study is not a good study, we don't endorse it, it is not officially part of this research journal anymore. Now that, of course, means that all of that anti-vaxxer stuff that came out of this study and its results is really problematic evidence. But that hasn't stopped the anti-vax movement, and it hasn't stopped Jenny McCarthy. Remember that 2007 interview? She continued even after 2010 defending her position. Here's what she said some years later. "This is what I have said. People have the misconception that we want to eliminate vaccines," I told Time magazine science editor Jeffrey Kluger in 2009. "Please understand that we are not an anti-vaccine group. We are demanding safe vaccines. We want to reduce the schedule and reduce the toxins." Two things here. A, the notion that there are toxins in the vaccines that cause things like autism has been thoroughly debunked by the scientific literature after the Wakefield retraction. B, she's defending these remarks in an interview in the Chicago Sun-Times on April 12, 2014, a full 4 years after the Wakefield study was retracted. So what does all of this mean? Well, what this means is just because you find it on Google doesn't mean it's right. Okay? What we need to do when we're looking at expertise is we need to think about this test in conjunction with other kinds of tests. For instance, the test of reliability, and, as we're going to talk about a little bit later on in this lesson, the test of recency. Okay, so there's expertise. You want to go to the primary sources, and you want to make sure that those sources are good sources. So now we've considered the first two of these 7 important tests for evaluating evidence: reliability and expertise. In the next segment of part 2 of our consideration of evidence, we're going to take a look at the next couple of tests. So until then, if you have any questions about what you've seen and heard so far, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video to test some more evidence.